The young shepherd David was anointed by God to be the future king of Israel. But the head of that nation's judicial system declared David to be an outlaw wanted not just dead or alive, but with a death warrant already issued. So David wrote these words of the 11th Psalm. He wrote, "In the Lord I take refuge. How then can you say to me, flee like a bird to your mountain? For look, the wicked bend their bows. They set their arrows against the strings to shoot from the shadows at the upright in heart. When the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do?" Yes, the foundations of justice were being destroyed when an innocent man like David was hunted by a corrupt judicial authority. The existing king, Saul, was that nation's highest judicial authority, and he wanted to make sure that David would not succeed him as the next king. So he used the judicial system to declare David an outlaw. Do we see something similar happening in the United States today? How will the Bible help us in our current situation? David was only a shepherd boy, the youngest among his brothers, when he showed his trust in God by facing off against Goliath when no one else would accept the challenge. That Philistine warrior was taller than our tallest basketball player, and he was covered with heavy armor and carried with him a sword and a spear and a javelin. David was armed only with a slingshot. David replied to the tall man's taunts by saying, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." And it was the God of Israel who gave David the victory over that enemy. Shortly before that, God had sent his prophet Samuel to pour out olive oil on David's head, anointing him to signify that David would someday be Israel's king. And before long, that young man was proving himself a hero over and over again in battles against that nation's enemies. And the people loved him and sang his praises. But Israel already had a king, a man named Saul, and Saul wanted to remain king and to have his son succeed him in office. That's why Saul issued a death warrant, declaring David an outlaw. The nation's law enforcement officers were under orders to kill David rather than arrest him. It was a total perversion of justice. And it was motivated by the ruling party, King Saul, being determined to do anything to keep David from assuming the office of king. It was then that David wrote at Psalm 11, verse 2, that the wicked bend their bows. They set their arrows against the strings to shoot from the shadows at the upright in heart. When the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? Yes, the foundations of justice were being destroyed because David was being hunted down like a criminal to keep him from becoming the next king. And in our country today, we too see the foundations of justice being destroyed. Just as King Saul feared David's popularity, the woke leftists who hold power in Washington fear the popularity of Donald Trump. They fear that the American people will re-elect Donald Trump president to replace the current administration, and they hate him. So they've branded him a criminal who should be jailed rather than re-elected. And just as King Saul did in ancient Israel, the Democrat leadership have perverted this nation's justice system to hunt him down. Of course, they can find some charge to pin on him to make their witch hunt look legitimate. They could do that with any wealthy businessman or with any powerful politician. Rich politicians have all done so many business transactions and used their power in so many situations that they all have at least a few shady deals to hide and questionable actions to cover up. What about Joe Biden when he was vice president? taking his son Hunter Biden to China with him on Air Force Two, resulting in business deals with China that brought millions of dollars to the Biden family. And what about Hunter Biden again, with nothing to offer of his own, no experience, just his father's name and influence, landing lucrative deals in Ukrainian oil, again profiting the Biden family. But the authorities and the press are focusing all their efforts on trying to find something against Donald Trump. Former President Trump pointed out that they've been running politically motivated investigations into his affairs for years and had yet to find anything to pin on him. I suppose if they keep digging, they will eventually find something or manufacture something that they can use. If you kept on digging for that long into the affairs of any of those politicians, I imagine you'd find something on all of them. To put all of this in perspective, it's important to look at the history of politically motivated prosecutions. Besides King Saul's political prosecution against David, the Bible also tells us of King Ahab and his wife Jezebel, who used their political power. They used their political power to get false witnesses to testify against their neighbor Naboth, and they ended up having Naboth put to death on that false testimony. And then there was Machiavelli in the 1400s. Machiavelli wrote a book advising men in power how to take extreme measures to eliminate their political opponents. Our own American Republic provides a bright spot in history when we consider how the Founding Fathers dealt with their differences. Our second president, John Adams, and our third president, Thomas Jefferson, were fierce political foes, running against each other in the presidential election of 1800. The news media of the day were filled with harsh rhetoric, pitting the one against the other. Jefferson won the election and unseated Adams to succeed him as president. Jefferson could then have used his newly acquired power to go after his political foe, Adams, using the judicial system, but he did not. And subsequent presidents down through our history have treated with honor and respect those who preceded them. The opposite was the case in the French Republic. The French Republic came into existence about the same time as the American Republic, during the days of Adams and Jefferson. Robespierre was a prominent leader of the new French Republic in 1793, but then political opponents had him arrested in 1794 and executed 2 days later. The guillotine in Paris was kept busy during what is called the Reign of Terror, when thousands of heads were chopped off for political reasons. What accounted for the mutual respect among leaders of the new American Republic and a much different bloody reign of terror in France? The main difference was that the American Founding Fathers based their approach to government on Christian faith and the Bible, whereas many of the leaders of the French Republic were what we today would call woke. They were radical leftists who repudiated Christianity and aimed to erase Christianity from French life entirely. For example, they converted the famous Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris into an atheistic temple of reason. They embraced atheistic communism and socialism as the cure for their society's problems, and they did not hesitate to use the guillotine to chop off the heads of their political opponents. So we should not be surprised that it is woke leftists today who are the most vocal about finding some grounds to prosecute Donald Trump and put him in jail or disqualify him from holding office in the future. And we see multiple efforts to accomplish that today on several different fronts, at least 5 different cases proceeding against the former president. New York officials are conducting 2 separate investigations of his business dealings, one a civil case and the other a criminal investigation. The Federal Justice Department also has 2 different lines of investigation in progress, one regarding storage of documents, and the other regarding the events of January 6. And then the Democrat-controlled Congress has been conducting televised public hearings for weeks, trying to connect President Trump to the January 6 demonstration at the Capitol. But the real reason for going after our former president is that he stood up against the evil power structure, and he did what was right when he was in power, instead of kowtowing to leftist ideology. The real reason they're going after the 45th president is that he protected Christians and protected the Christian values that have historically guided our country. They hate him because he negated the bathroom bill that Obama had put in that cut off funding to schools if the schools didn't set up transgender bathroom use. The woke leftists sent the boys into the girls' bathroom and the girls into the boys' bathroom in schools across the country, enforced by the federal government. And President Trump put a stop to that. They also want to get President Trump because he ended enforcement of the Johnson Amendment that threatened to take away the tax exemption from churches if they spoke out on political matters. They also hate President Trump because he took action to protect Christian medical workers from punishment at their jobs because they wouldn't perform abortions. They hate him because refugees coming into America under Obama were 2% Christian, and Trump changed it to 60% Christians being allowed in. They want to get him and destroy him because he attended the pro-life Right to Life March, the first president to do so in 40 years. They hate him because he filed a brief at the Supreme Court in support of a baker to uphold that baker's right not to make a cake for a gay wedding. They're out to get President Trump because he stopped funding Planned Parenthood with federal money. They hate him because through the Taylor Force Act, he cut funding to the United Nations agency that was paying Palestinians and rewarding them when they killed Jews. They hate him because he moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. They hate President Trump because he funded $110 million to rebuild Christian and religious minorities in Iraq and Syria. They hate him because he formed an agency to ensure freedom of religious minorities, especially Christians in Iraq. They're out to get him because he demanded and put sanctions on Turkey and forced Turkey to release an American pastor from a Turkish prison. They hate President Trump because he put through a command that military transgenders must serve under their biological gender instead of the gender they choose to identify with. They're out to get him because he stopped the military from paying for gender change operations. And they hate him because he curtailed federal funding for research involving fetal tissue. They hate him because he tried to stop federal money from paying for abortions for illegal immigrants, even though the Democrats overrode his efforts. And all of that I just listed, all of that is the real reason why the criminal justice system has been hijacked by woke leftists to attack President Trump. An attack is the right word for it. After the August 8th FBI raid on President Trump's Mar-a-Lago home, a legal expert noted that such a raid is usually reserved for drug dealers and violent criminals. In a case like President Trump's, investigators would negotiate with his lawyers, but would never resort to the extreme measure of raiding a private residence, especially the home of a former president of the United States. But how did they get a judge to issue a warrant for such an unusual search? There were several reports in the news that this particular judge had been a lawyer in private practice just a few years ago, and that he was the lawyer hired to defend employees of Jeffrey Epstein. Now, as for the congressional committee hearings on the events of January 6th, if it weren't such a tragic episode for this country, It would almost be comical to watch the supposed evidence and testimony that they broadcast to smear President Trump. If you've ever watched Judge Judy on TV, you've heard her many times stop people from offering hearsay evidence to support their cases. The plaintiff will start to say, for example, "The police officer told me," and then Judge Judy will stop the plaintiff mid-sentence and say, "You can't tell me what someone else said. That's hearsay. Hearsay evidence is not admissible in court." But the Congressional Committee has presented mountains of hearsay. A star witness, former White House aide they produced, testified that she heard someone say that someone else said such and such. That's hearsay evidence. Actually, it's double hearsay, twice removed from the actual speaker. And she did that over and over again, testifying that she heard someone tell her what someone else supposedly said. Judge Judy respects the rules of evidence used in courts throughout the land, and she would never allow such hearsay, even in her small claims court on TV. Yet the Congressional Committee gladly produced such inadmissible testimony and broadcast it to the American people. There is a term that has long been used to describe such a sham investigation or trial. It's called a kangaroo court. The Wikipedia describes it this way. It says a kangaroo court is a court that ignores recognized standards of law or justice, carries little or no official standing in the territory within which it resides, and is typically convened ad hoc. A kangaroo court may ignore due process and come to a predetermined conclusion. The term may also apply to a court held by a legitimate judicial authority which intentionally disregards the court's legal or ethical obligations. Compare show trial. The trials that sent people to the guillotine in the French Republic were conducted by a kangaroo court. Adolf Hitler employed kangaroo courts to prosecute his political opponents. And now we see kangaroo courts being used by woke leftists in America to go after the former president and his associates. The news media, too, have been a major factor in putting the former president on trial unfairly in the press. The news media have freely used fake news to turn people against Donald Trump. One of the most blatant examples was the video shown on TV news on January 6th of last year and during the news reports on subsequent days. The video showed President Trump addressing supporters at his rally, and in that doctored video, he appeared to say, "We're going to the Capitol, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." But the problem is that he did not say that. The news media took two different parts of his speech and spliced the video together to make a sentence that the president never spoke. His reference to fighting like hell was from an earlier part of his speech, when he was talking about future plans to work for improved election security to stop voter fraud. He said that immediately after, saying, "Our brightest days are before us, our greatest achievements still wait." And he indicated he was going to fight to accomplish those achievements in the brighter days ahead. Then moments later in that speech, he said, "We're going to the Capitol." The dishonest and corrupt news media took his expression, "We're going to the Capitol," and spliced it together with his earlier reference about fighting for future accomplishments. And they produced a false doctored video that appeared to show him saying something he did not say. CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network, later apologized for showing the doctored video, but only a relative handful of people saw any apologies or corrections. The news media showed that fake video to millions of Americans to make them think the president said something that he never said at all. With similar fraudulent evidence and constant accusations, the news media have poisoned the minds of millions against our 45th president, who did so much good for this country. Obviously, I don't know President Trump personally, and I can't speak with any authority about his personal relationship with Christ or lack thereof, but I can say with certainty that the good things that he accomplished, that I listed one by one a few moments ago, any one of us who has a biblical worldview would have done the same things if we had the opportunity. We would have blocked government payments for abortion and for transgender surgeries. We would have put an end to Obama's decree sending boys into the girls' showers and restrooms. We would have upheld the right of a baker not to be forced to make a cake for a homosexual wedding. We would have upheld the right of workers in the medical field not to be forced to take part in abortions. The good things President Trump did were things that any of us Christian believers would have done. So there is truth in his statement when he said, "In reality, they're not after me, they're after you. I'm just in the way." He said that back in 2019 when he was still in office and was being impeached after another kangaroo court investigation. He said, "In reality, they're not after me, they are after you. I'm just in the way." Yes, their real target is the Christian values our nation was built on, and anyone who upholds and promotes those values. They are after us. So we can identify with the Psalmist David and the words he wrote in the 11th Psalm. We know what it feels like when, as David wrote in the second verse, "The wicked bend their bows, they set their arrows against the strings, to shoot from the shadows at the upright in heart." And then verse 3 asks, "When the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do?" David's answer can be our answer as well. He continues in Psalm 11, verse 4, "The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord is on his heavenly throne. He observes everyone on earth. His eyes examine them. The Lord examines the righteous, but the wicked, those who love violence, he hates with a passion. On the wicked he will rain fiery coals and burning sulfur. A scorching wind will be their lot. For the Lord is righteous. He loves justice. The upright will see his face." What can we do when the foundations are being destroyed? We can rest on Jesus Christ, the solid rock, and we can focus on the Bible, the written word of God, where we will find truth that cannot be denied. Now is the time for God's people to spend more time reading the Bible, to spend more time fellowshipping with believers, to spend more time in prayer, and to be prepared for persecution. And our prayer is for the change of government that will come when God answers that constant prayer for his kingdom to come and for his will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. Come, Lord Jesus.